This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt Podcast. I just wanted to thank all the patrons that helped pay the bills for the show. Last week, some of the advertising I was promised for 2021 was canceled without notice. So thank you again, patrons. Your money goes towards the website hosting, podcast hosting, music licensing, and research materials. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. In this case, you will hear two different versions of an altercation that took place. And ironically, there were two different legal outcomes. You're listening to episode 41, Dusty Harless. Dusty Harless was born on August 24th, 1970, in Germany, but parents Kathy and Clinton raised him under the California sun. He enjoyed living in San Diego and took part in many outdoor activities like surfing, wakeboarding, skiing, and snowboarding. Dusty wasn't the tallest guy at 5'8", but his size worked well for wrestling. He was a championship-level wrestler that won many competitions and received a myriad of accolades over the years. Dusty wrestled on a collegiate level for Palomar College, which is just north of San Diego, and he was the AAU national champion. After college, Dusty followed his passion for athletics and took a job as an advertising sales rep for innovative marketing ventures where he sold wakeboards. He was an outgoing person who lived for athletics, so the job perfectly married his passions of wakeboarding and sales. Dusty was succeeding in every bucket of his life. He had a job he enjoyed. He was an up-and-coming wakeboarder who was featured in Wakeboard magazine. He had lots of friends in his life and had a fiancée, Sky Flanders. On April 18th, 1996, 25-year-old Dustin Harless's life was about to change when he had a chance meeting with a 25-year-old San Diego State University finance major named David Genzler. Sky and Dusty were having a night out on the town in San Diego and had just left a bar. They were headed to a nearby liquor store to use the telephone because they needed a cab ride home. It was a dark, rainy night, and Sky ran ahead of Dusty to find shelter from the rain under a canopy of a nearby building. She stood there, momentarily alone, while Dusty was zipping up his coat across the street. David Genzler drove up to Sky and asked her if she needed a ride. Sky promptly declined the offer and told the motorist that she was with someone. Dusty caught up to Sky and saw the stranger talking with his fiancée. He went over to Genzler's car and the two men had a verbal exchange. It wasn't long before Genzler was outside of his car and the two men were rolling on the ground. David Genzler was lanky and looked more like a bookworm than someone who was ready to pull punches. Genzler was likely in the biggest scrap of his life with a collegiate national champion wrestler. A naval officer named Scott Davis, who was also a bar bouncer and had just finished his shift, was driving by and saw the two men fighting. He pulled over to see if he could help because he had recognized Dusty. Genzler pulled a knife from his pocket and stabbed Dusty. Both David Genzler and witness Scott Davis fled the scene. Dusty was left laying on the ground, bleeding out from the stab wound that he had taken to the neck. He died before the paramedics arrived. Sky remembered Genzler's license plate number, and this allowed police to track the car down. It was registered to Genzler's mother, but she didn't know where her son was or her car. David Genzler did not realize the extent of Dusty's injuries, or that Dusty had passed away. After learning of the gravity of the situation, Genzler turned himself into authorities. He, however, cooperated little with law enforcement. Investigators tried to find out what happened during the fight between Genzler and Harless. Scott Davis, who witnessed the fight, eventually came forward. He said he saw Genzler swing and hit Dusty, which put Dusty on the ground. Then he saw Genzler take a top position over Dusty and inflict the fatal stab wound. Scott Davis said he fled the crime scene because Genzler had threatened him. He denied taking part in the altercation. David Genzler said Harless dragged him out of his car, punched him in the face, slammed him down, pinned his arm, and held him face down on the ground. He said Scott Davis jumped into the fight and was kicking him in the head as Dusty held him down. Genzler said he pulled a knife out of his pocket and just took a blind stab at Dusty's shoulder to escape from the beating. Then he jumped in his car and drove away. Investigators went to work to sort out what was reality and what was fiction, given the competing narratives in this crime. The car Genzler drove that night was found abandoned in the city and was swabbed for traces of blood. The swabs were positive for Dusty's DNA. The direct evidence pleased the investigators. This linked Genzler to the crime scene, so they didn't solely have to rely on eyewitness testimony. An autopsy determined that the cause of death was a 4-inch stab wound to Dusty's aorta. A friend of Genzler's brought forward the bloody shirt that belonged to him and was worn on the night of the altercation. The front of his shirt was covered in blood, and there was very little blood on the back of it. The prosecution was confident that Harless and Genzler were face-to-face when the stabbing took place, and felt that Genzler's story about the altercation was just not true. Genzler's lawyers maintain Harless held Genzler face down on the ground when the stabbing took place. After all, Dusty Harless was a championship-level wrestler, and David Genzler was a skinny kid who had never been in trouble with the law. They filed a criminal complaint on May 24, 1996. The trial was straightforward. Skye was an important witness for Deputy DA Peter Longenbach, who prosecuted the case. Skye testified that Genzler was the aggressor of the altercation. The blood evidence supported that Genzler was the aggressor. The jury didn't buy that Genzler was defending himself and convicted him of second-degree murder. David Genzler was given a 20 years to life sentence. They sent Genzler to Mule Creek State Prison in Iwanee, California to serve his time. David Genzler appealed his case. He had offered several reasons as to why he was owed a new trial. Genzler claimed there was prosecutorial misconduct. He said that there was enough evidence in his case to support that he was acting in self-defense, and therefore the jury should have been given instructions on the criteria to meet an involuntary manslaughter conviction. Also in his trial, the judge had improperly recused his lawyer, Gerald Blank. Before Genzler's trial, the prosecutor had filed a pretrial motion because he wanted the defense to turn over evidence. Genzler's ex-girlfriend, Sherry Logel, was given immunity and testified that she had given bloody clothing and a knife to the defense attorney, Gerald Blank. Gerald said that he received the clothing and turned it over to the prosecution, but said that he had not received a knife. Prosecutor Peter Longenbach immediately asked the judge to recuse Gerald Blank. Genzler's ex-girlfriend testified she had lied about delivering the knife to defense attorney Blank. Longenbach said he was going to use both Gerald Blank and Sherry Logel as trial witnesses. The judge did recuse Gerald Blank from being Genzler's attorney. Later on, Sherry Logel admitted Longenbach had pressured her to give untruthful testimony about her interactions with the defense attorney. The California Court of Appeals agreed that the judge improperly recused Genzler's attorney and that the jury should have been instructed about involuntary manslaughter. However, the court did not agree that there was misconduct. we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Thank you to Best Fiends for sponsoring this episode of Beyond Contempt True Crime. Podcast listeners, let me tell you about Best Fiends. It's an engaging puzzle game that everyone is playing. It's a relaxed game that you play on your phone. Best Fiends keeps adding new levels and events all the time, so the game is always fresh and exciting. It's a great game to play when I need to take a break from watching true crime documentaries. That Hulu True Crime channel can really suck you in. And you don't even need to be tethered to Wi-Fi to play Best Fiends. You can play it without an internet connection, which is great for me because my internet provider sometimes drops the ball, like a lot. Trust me, you really don't want to miss out on this game. Join me and the millions of people who are already playing this fun puzzle game. Download Best Fiends, free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Hi everyone. I really need to tell you about BetterHelp Online Counseling. It's an affordable service where you can connect with one of their licensed professional therapists. You can find counselors that specialize in just about anything, including anxiety, depression, family conflicts, trauma, and LGBTQ issues. I work from home and barely leave my house, so it's great that you can communicate with your counselor from the privacy of your own home. BetterHelp is more affordable than traditional in-person counseling, and financial aid is available. So many people have been using BetterHelp that they are recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states, and you can start talking with your counselor in less than 24 hours. I want you to start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health. Again, that's betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Now, back to the show. They awarded David Genzler a second trial, which began in August 2000. The defense team put together a solid case with various experts, and they poked holes in what witnesses told investigators initially versus what was testified to in court. They brought in character witnesses and used animation to help support their self-defense claim. Hall of Fame wrestler Ned Blass was brought in to help explain why there was blood on the front of Genzler's shirt, even if he was pinned face down on the ground. Ned Blass showed the court and jurors a very common wrestling maneuver that a champion wrestler like Dusty Harless would have used on someone untrained like Genzler, and this would have easily put Genzler face down on the ground. The defense team utilized forensic animation, which showed how Genzler could have stabbed Dusty even though he was face down, with Dusty riding on his back. The frame-by-frame model showed how Genzler would have flipped around right after the knife entered Dusty's aorta, which would have resulted in the front of his shirt being covered in blood. A medical expert testified that blood does not immediately flow out of the aorta because it travels at a cadence, which would be determined by a person's heartbeat. So it was possible that Dusty wasn't bleeding out immediately until Genzler rolled over and faced him. The defense brought several witnesses who testified Dusty was the type of person who started fights with other men. Sky Flanders' original statement to investigators also supported that Dusty was not afraid to get into physical fights. She told them about a time when she was at a bar with Dusty, and another man said something uncouth to her. Dusty gave that man a severe beatdown once they were both outside of the bar. Sky heard stories about other fights that Dusty got into and won. In her initial videotaped interview with investigators, Sky Flanders told them that Dusty threw Genzler to the ground with a wrestling move. He would not let Genzler up, and that was when Genzler stabbed him. But in the first trial, her testimony was much different. She said that David Genzler was the aggressor and the instigator of the altercation. Later on, Sky admitted she did not want to help the defense team, and that was why she gave the testimony that she did. She also felt pressured by the prosecutor and the investigator to downplay Dusty's history of getting into fights. A toxicology report showed Dusty had enough alcohol to be considered legally intoxicated, and there were traces of marijuana in his system. Genzler's claim of self-defense seemed much more believable for the jury in the second trial. They found him guilty of the lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter. On February 14, 2001, the judge sentenced him to time served, and he was set free, since he had already done 6 years in prison. David Genzler spent some hard time in jail, and he felt the prosecutor had truly wronged him in that first trial. Genzler sued Peter Longenbach for misconduct with pressuring Sky Flanders to commit perjury. He also alleged that the supervisors in the DA's office condoned Longenbach's unethical behavior. Sky told police that Dusty flipped David Genzler to the ground and held him there when Genzler stabbed him. Sky told the police that Dusty engaged in fights. After Sky met with prosecutor Peter Longenbach and his investigator, Jeffrey O'Brien, she then stated that she didn't remember the fight very well. She withheld Dusty's history of getting into fights. Sky added that Scott Davis pulled David Genzler off Dusty Harless, which was a 180-degree reversal of her initial statement. A settlement was reached in 2006, but the amount of the payout was never reported. There were also some allegations that Longenbach was stealing from the government and that he was working on his personal real estate business during his scheduled work hours. Peter Longenbach had his law license suspended for 2 years. Dusty Harless's funeral was well attended. He had many friends because he was an outgoing person. A group of his friends got out on their surfboards and paddled out into the Pacific Ocean. They tossed wreaths into the water to pay tribute to their departed friend. Dusty was put to rest in Beaverhead County, Montana. Sky Flanders was never prosecuted for committing perjury and was never sued by David Genzler. Dusty's mother, Kathy Harless, had a hard time with the outcome of Genzler's second trial. She didn't believe that her son was a person who got into fights, and those people who testified to that fact were just not fans of her son. She also blamed Sky Flanders for ruining prosecutor Peter Longenbach's career. In her view, Dusty's trial was more focused on the DA's misconduct instead of the murder of her son. Kathy Harless moved to Butte, Montana, as she had family in the area. Kathy's family, including some of her sisters, her 2 daughters, and her grandchildren, either lived in Montana or Wyoming. She worked as a caretaker for a ranch, but ended up moving back to San Diego, where one of her sisters was still living. Kathy spent her time volunteering with equestrians who ride in events like the Rose Parade in Pasadena. She was also a skilled florist and fixed floral arrangements for all the riders. The group that she was a part of had a philanthropic bent and often raised money for charity. Even though her work was volunteer-based, her life was very full and often busy. Kathy was running an errand and dropped her friend off, with whom she boarded her 2 horses. She was driving just east of San Diego when a drunk driver in a pickup truck crossed the center line and hit her Chevy Silverado 1500 truck head-on. Kathy had her 2 dogs with her, and she was not wearing her seatbelt. She passed away at the accident scene, as did her beloved dogs. At age 63, Kathy returned home to Montana and joined Dusty in Beaverhead County, where she was laid to rest. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for the links to the sources and the music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and music scoring were performed by me, Renee. Thank you to new patron, Monty M. I appreciate your support. If you like the show, please leave me a positive review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.